on the page with no effort to solve them by argument. I wrote about being stuck on that piece of hardness in my heart, about wanting but not finding an exit from the contradiction. I wrote it over and over, losing count of repetitions. And then, as so often happened in the journal process, the answer came to me. Forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who have trespassed against us, I wrote on the page. It seemed to come from nowhere, but of course there is no nowhere. I had picked up a wealth of wisdom bit by saying yes instead of no, approaching the places that might have something true or wise that I should encounter. Even though I could no longer believe that God had sacrificed his son Jesus for our sins and that Jesus had defeated death by rising from the tomb, I occasionally attended Mass. I prayed sincerely anything that seemed true. That included particularly the Lord's Prayer, what we called as children the Our Father. Dozens of times I had prayed, forgive us our trespasses as we forgive those who trespass against us, embodying the fervent intention as I held the hands of the women to either side of me in the prison chapel pews. And that plea from that prayer came to soften my heart at the moment I so needed it. I had broken through. I saw that if I wanted forgiveness, however vaguely I defined that, how I would have to understand that I was in a universe of forgiveness for all, no one excluded. I went back to the task of writing the parole questionnaire with the understanding that my accountability, no one else's, was the heart of the process I was engaged in. Perhaps the architects of war would be called to account. Perhaps not. And they could be redeemed and accountable at the same time, just as I could. On the day of the parole hearing, I dressed in black pants, a white shirt, and a black jacket, my most formal clothes. I repeated to myself my intentions for the day, that I would open my heart in compassion to embrace everything that came my way. I would breathe, and I would notice aversion and attachment. I would notice that feelings arise, but they are not me. Thoughts arise, but they are not me. I would surrender the need to know what would happen and when. Change is the nature of everything. I was escorted, shackled and manacled, to the transport car in the middle of the morning. We pulled away from the prison, a Department of Corrections car in front of us and one behind, with visibly armed officers inside. As the three cars traveled in caravan, in constant communication by radio, I realized they were protecting me from anyone who might want to shoot me, as well as preventing me from escaping. I remembered that ordinary as I felt, sometimes I was in an extraordinary life. We drove down Route 9 onto the Mass Pike, off the Mass Pike, then down some small, dark, one-way streets, and stopped at an old brick building on a street with a sign that read, Wormwood. I got out of the car carefully, making sure the leg chains were not tangled, and was immediately surrounded by a block of uniformed and plainclothes officers, shielding me again from whatever unexpected thing might come at us. They hustled me into the building, up an elevator, and into a room with a conference table. They uncuffed the manacles from the waist chain and cuffed me to the chair. A uniformed officer was posted outside the door. A clock in the room showed it was around 11 a.m. I had thought the day would start much earlier, that I would already be in front of the parole board by now. Then I remembered that today I would surrender to changes in schedule, to questions, challenges, insults, kindnesses, to anything and everything. I meditated. Around 2, I opened up the sack lunch and ate, grateful for peanut butter and jelly on white bread. I wondered if the officer outside the door was tired from standing so straight and still for hours. I meditated. Officers brought me water, and I thanked them. At some point, I had to use the bathroom and was escorted by the door protector and a female officer who came into the bathroom with me. Around 4, a team came in and uncuffed me from the chair. It's time, they said. They walked me down the hall into the hearing room. The 5 members of the parole board sat at a table in the front of the room. The officers seated me at a table facing them, my hands uncuffed but with shackles still on my ankles. Behind me were 30 or so chairs arranged in rows. I knew that members of Walter Schroeder's family and community occupied those chairs, but a strict protocol forbade any interaction between us. Miss Power, one of the board began, we understand that your behavior while incarcerated has been exemplary, that you have been a fine and upstanding citizen at Framingham. If everyone there behaved as you have, it would be a lovely place to be. But that is not what we are here to consider today. Instead, we will be deciding whether the interests of justice are served by your release from prison to the community on parole at this time. The members of the board questioned me for more than an hour. Two moments stand out in my memory. One board member read from my statement. I went along riding a high of pent-up anger finally released. The relief that came from feeling finally able to do something, anything, to feel useful instead of powerless. Finally able to do something, anything, he said. Would that include something like the bombing of the Oklahoma City courthouse where 168 people were killed? I started to protest. I would never have done something like that. I never set out to harm anyone. I could see how empty this rang. Why should he believe me? After all, I had gone so far beyond what I thought I would. Why not all the way to the slaughter of children? The other question I remember is, why do you think we should grant you parole, Miss Power? Do you think you have served a long enough sentence for the murder of Walter Schroeder? I don't want parole for myself, I said. I could serve the rest of my sentence, but my son needs me. This is a difficult time in his life. I need to be there for him. Do you realize the profound irony of what you are saying, Miss Power? He responded. After all, Walter Schroeder's children had needed him too, but he hadn't been there for them because he had been murdered by a gang of gun-toting bank robbers. Throughout all this back and forth, I could tell that what I had come there to do was not happening. I did not know how to shift the conversation to my abject sorrow for Walter Schroeder's death. After this question, I was moved to a seat at the side of the room. It was time for the people who opposed my release on parole to testify. Marie Schroeder, Walter Schroeder's widow, talked about her fear for her children who are police officers when they go out to work every day. How she cannot talk to her grandchildren about this fear that their mother or father will never come home again. His brother testified that the 4.5 years I had spent in prison were simply not enough to pay for my crimes, particularly for his brother's murder. Two of the older Schroeder sons testified about how their lives had been changed, about how hard their lives were after the murder of their father. One said that he too had opposed the Viet Nam War, but had been too busy with college studies to protest. They could have been my friends and colleagues in Oregon, these men. They could have been my cousins. They requested that the members of the board deny my application for parole and require that I serve my whole sentence in prison. Through all this, I sat on the sidelines with tears streaming, listening, opening my heart, watching for some moment when I would discern what to do or say that would address their sorrow and loss, that would express my contrition. Then it was Claire Schroeder's turn to speak. She addressed my written statement and all that I had said in the hearing. She spoke scathingly about our gun-toting romanticism that had left her father dead. One of her brothers had been killed a few years earlier. She talked about how the person who killed him was charged with manslaughter and sentenced to a few years in prison. They did not feel that that was enough, but it was what the law said, and they were people who honored the law. Then she talked about my own surrender and plea agreement. I was to be sentenced to serve 8 to 12 years. Again, they did not feel this was enough, but it was all the law could offer them. They accepted it. And now she doesn't even want to keep that agreement, Claire said. Right then I thought of every peace process I had ever learned about, how the two sides each held their own narrative of the history, how peace broke through when one side could really see the other side's narrative as legitimate, at least equally with their own. To my loved ones, the agreement was that I would return home in 5 years. That the release would be a parole was a meaningless distinction. I had done my time, done my inner work. To Walter Schroeder's people, that sentence meant serving the entire time behind bars in a medium security prison, away from ordinary life and family. Finally, Claire noted the eloquence of my acceptance of responsibility for my crimes and found it wanting. Where was this remorse when I surrendered? And in every statement I have made since then, she pointed out that anyone with half a brain would know they had to take responsibility and show remorse in order to be paroled. In that moment, I knew what to do. I was returned to the table before the board to make any final remarks. It is clear, I said to them, that what I came here to do today, which is to express my unconditional remorse for my actions in the murder of Walter Schroeder, cannot be accomplished as long as it is attached to a request to be released on parole. Therefore, I withdraw my parole request. There followed a stunned silence and the shuffling of papers. The head of the board took up her pen and said, "Let me make sure I have this right. You are withdrawing your request for parole?" She read back what I had said, and I affirmed it. I was escorted into the next room and manacled again. Officers walked me through the hallways and down the stairs out into the night that had fallen by now. Flashbulbs popped, reporters shouted questions. I ignored them. I thought that what I had done that day would probably become another big news story, but I did not care. All that was in another universe of fighting and enemies, not the world of the open heart I had somehow found my way into in those last moments. Thank you for bearing with it. And now, let me just do a time check here. Okay, we're done. I want to read something shorter, but it really addresses the horror of the time we're living in. You know, I finished this book 3 years ago before the election, and then I had to rewrite the last chapter. And in the same way that I couldn't find a language for my son's loss until I found the Sestina form, I couldn't find a language for writing about the times we're in. It took me a long time. And I want to share, I'm hoping that this is the final portion of the book, and I want to tell you that it refers to some things that are practices here on these cards in which I've collected the wisdom of my entire experience, and they're up here for the taking. So if you miss a point, it's okay, it's here. This is a frightening time. In the 2016 Trump campaign, the not enough alarm was brilliantly exploited to consolidate the power of concentrated wealth. Trump's election has whipped up a lust for dominance and encouraged public expressions of hate and violence. It has raised white supremacy to such respectability that political candidates openly claim it as their platform. They celebrate the dismantling of every social support system, attacking the value of mutuality that those institutions have been built on. I am afraid of the stories of willingness to torture, of rules that say coal ash can be dumped into streams, of the reassertion of men's rule over women's bodies, of prescription for holy war against Islam. I feel like my survival is threatened and I have to stop these people. They are going to wreck the world. I don't know how we are going to do this. With circumstances so dire, we have to vie for power in the institutions and mechanisms of the dominance order. But if we stop there, we will be defeated. Dominators will always prevail in struggles for raw power. We need to, and we can, recover and restore a mutualistic order a way of living that recognizes our interconnection not just with other human beings, but with the natural world. A dominator order can maintain itself through brute force, but more often it prevails by occupying our minds. Fear is dominator's most effective tool. It keeps us stirred up and on alert with the stream of threats. We are drawn in to fight head-to-head in conflicts where the current order has far more power. We turn our attention to fighting this particular bad thing, and then that one, and then another, until we have exhausted ourselves defending and defeating. We can see this in Trump's, Ryan's, and McConnell's streams of threats to every bit of social progress that has been achieved for the last 50 years. Humans thrive as a species because we cooperate so effectively. Biologists have studied the problem of cooperation extensively. How could it evolve? In the biology of cooperation, many individual organisms do not maximize their own individual biological potential, and the resulting restraint provides some adaptive advantage for the group. But in all kinds of cooperative systems, there are some organisms that maximize their own potential, regardless of the effect on the group. Why don't the greedy always out-reproduce the cooperators? Why hasn't the mutualistic possibility been completely wiped out in a survival of the fittest scenario? Studies of yeast colonies suggest one answer. Yeast organisms have two metabolic paces available. One is moderate, one is speeded up. The individual organisms that use this speeded up pace grow faster and outproduce the moderates. But the fast-paced individuals produce more toxins than they can clear from their environment. In the colonies where the fast-paced organisms dominate, they eventually poison the environment and the whole colony dies. In colonies where the moderates greatly outnumber the fast-paced, they can clear their own toxins plus those produced by the selfish, and the colony thrives. It turns out that pure selfishness is only a successful strategy in the short run. This sounds to me a lot like the economic world we are experiencing right now. In the yeast colony, the only way the mutualistic order can contain the dominator and keep it from wrecking the world is to do mutuality more energetically and effectively. The lesson is that we don't have to defeat dominators. We have to out-cooperate them. How, in the face of today's forces, do we strengthen mutuality? I find myself looking for guidance to all the tools and wisdom I have ever encountered in my long journey from guerrilla to grandmother. I gathered what I have learned into 6 practices that I think of as a pocket guide to practical peace. The foundation practices are mindfulness and compassion, training our body, mind, to be free of the ways that domination tries to occupy us. Mindfulness makes a space between the sensations, emotions, and thoughts that arise and the stories we make out of them. Compassion prepares us to encounter the world and the beings in it with a heart turned toward goodwill. Skill at applying our freer minds leads to a general state of equanimity, and from there I find it easier to remember and apply concepts that I have found useful and true. In particular, non-judgment and gratitude. Non-judgment, an idea that arises in both postmodern and Jungian psychology, means seeing that whatever we think we know about others is a projection from our own disowned darkness and our historical and cultural point of view. Gratitude, an understanding I have learned from sources as wide-ranging as radical Christianity, earth-centered spirituality, and Buddhism, means to receive everything that comes, the welcome and the unwelcome, the comforting and the discomfiting. It is a powerful source of creative vision that keeps us out of the wasted energies of pushing away or grasping for more. I take these concepts then out into the world as non-enmity and action. I learned non-enmity from many mystical traditions and from my prison experience of trying to be at peace when people had declared that they would be my enemies. It means refusing to be in the relationship of enemy with others. Believing that the conflict and estrangement are not necessarily permanent. And by action, I mean both the obligation we each have to recognize the unjust suffering we are part of, and also taking literally the lesson both of complex adaptive systems and of creation spirituality. This moment is the initial condition of the rest of time. The future is unfolding, and actions we take now can matter in ways that we cannot know. Thank you. Do we have a little time for question and answer?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah.
Or comment.
I just have a comment.
Sure.
Let's get the ERA passed.
Yeah,
Finally.
there are so many actions that we can all be involved in. And you know, we sometimes get stuck in, oh, which is the most important one, which is the best one. You know what? There is no best one. There's no most important one. Everybody act all the time. Sometimes we see a way to act together and make a particular impact. Sometimes, and this is true in complexity, we think we're going to have a certain outcome, and we don't. And that's why letting go of the outcome matters so much. Because one of the things we do, and this is why I title my book Surrender, is that if we go head to head in a fight, we're going to get beaten, almost always. And sometimes we're going to win, but a lot of the time we're going to get beaten. And there's a power in stepping away from that head-to-head fight with power and saying, what else here is waiting for this whole system to change, and I can help it. The underpinnings of dominance are eroding and cracking everywhere. Where can I be part of that? Where can I be part of joining people whose worlds don't normally overlap? So, yes, pass that ERA. And yes, fight for 15. And yes, all those things. And also, watch where this whole complex system that's made out of so many subsystems all interacting with one another and all full of their own contradictions is waiting to collapse. We just have to help it and prepare for soft landings.
Kathy, I think the phrase "go where your passion is applicable here. When you consider, you know, I want to do this to help the world. I want to do this. I want to do this. I think if we go for what's most important to us, where our heart is, we'll be the most effective.
Yeah, and I think we want to keep our vision broad, even as we might keep our action focused. So we know who else is doing what, and we know that we might think of something, but it has a blind spot that we didn't see about their lives. So if we're in relationship with lots of people from different points of view, places in the culture, working on change, then we can be wiser and more discerning in the ways we pursue the action that's calling to us.
Yeah.
Could you expand more on mutuality, what you mean by that, and how you foresee it working in reality?
Right. In fact, it works in reality really well in a lot of our lives right now. In our friendships and in our family relationships a lot of the time. But a great deal of research, let's see, what is her name? Jean? I was going to write her name down. There's a researcher at Wellesley who has done a tremendous amount of work in the way that we are biologically programmed to be cooperative and to be connected with other human beings. It's from like every level of our physiology, from neurology to our hormones, to our stories and our cultures, And we are in a backwater right now that has untold the story of that. And so the only way people can live is in enmity and competition. You know, that only came up 500 years ago when the Europeans went out and conquered the world. I mean, the indigenous people who had to learn to live with one biome and one another have many mutualistic ways to live. They have a lot of internal accountability. They have a lot of sense of connection with the earth and just sense of connection in general. And I think that's one of the most important pieces of it. So I think a couple of things. There's a lot of building the new economy going on. And those are economic forms that are based on relationship and not commodity. So just growing them. Just participating everywhere that we look, everything that we do is an action in some system that we could become conscious of what our action in that system contributes to the lives of other people and to the stability and strength of that system. So if we start buying fair trade coffee, now if one individual does that, you know, we can all feel all righteous because we recycle and we do this and we do. It's not the individual. But if a lot of us do that, and we do it not, oh, it's our ideal, it's doing, but we do it in relationship with the coffee producers, a whole new economy arises. And let me tell you an impact of that. After Hurricane, I think it was Hugo, it destroyed a lot of the coffee fincas in Chiapas, Mexico. Now, the way that coffee is grown it can be in full shade as part of a jungle understory, and it provides year-round food and other products. And there's another way that it can be done, which is to use full sun, lots of cash-heavy inputs. Now, what's interesting to me is that on a 30-year cycle, shade-grown coffee returns better even if you don't count the externalities of bananas. But capital is geared toward this cycle. Well, what would typically happen after that hurricane in those fincas is that they would be replanted with full sun, heavy input. But there was a relationship with coffee roasters and coffee consumers in this country, and they provided the capital for an enduring, mutualistic replanting of that coffee. Those are everywhere we look. Yeah.
I just want to say I loved your reading, I love what you're saying, and it's so brilliant, really. But I keep thinking, you know, I mean, as you said, we're in this super scary time right now, and I believe in everything that you're talking about so deeply. But I'm feeling this, I feel like we may have to fight, not in the way that we'd like to fight, but we may have to fight. I mean, I feel like this is such a dire time. And all of the language and all of the energy, and I'm with you. I believe that there's so many cracks in that power structure, and I hope it collapses. And I think, you know, with all of this energy and all of us coming together, that is going to make a huge difference. But what if it doesn't?
Well,
you know,
let me say why I use the phrase, or the phrase non-enmity.
Yeah.
That we can be in an oppositional struggle without othering the force and the people acting it out that are on the other side of that struggle. We can struggle fiercely. We are vying in the mechanisms and systems of dominance because everybody's life depends on it. One of the problems is when our life depends on it, we really get narrow vision and we get head to head, and it's really easy to think of that as evil. And that means it's an enemy. That means it has no contradictions. It has no possibility of redemption. So what about the story that a handful of evangelical women, mothers in Texas, has stopped supporting Ted Cruz and are supporting Beto O'Rourke?
Yeah.
Because they realized that they were focused so narrowly on their opposition to abortion that they were choosing people who didn't care about children after they were born. They got that. They said, we got that. And they opened up and, talk about a crack. So what we don't want to do is stiffen all of these places that are full of contradictions.
Totally, yeah.
By hardening them in our own mind, in our own theory about what they are.
Yeah.
So, one of the most useful phrases, this came from one of the Black Panthers by way of somebody from the Catholic left who used to tell it to me. She said, the Panthers in Baltimore would say, heighten the contradictions, sister, heighten the contradictions. Well, so Chuck Willer, who comes from the 1%, is out there, you know what he's doing? He's heightening the contradictions of very, very rich people who want to think of themselves as good people and who want to remain connected with more of humanity than just their little club of 400. And he is inviting them back in to the family. So if we said there's no possibility there, that weakening of the system could be missed. So we oppose and we weaken and we create and we do it together, and that's part of why I put together the pocket guide, because I felt like I needed to guide myself in how to achieve like a fierceness without falling into a war.
Yeah. Right on.
I was in D.C. with the protesters, the Kavanaugh protesters, so I wanted to ask your opinion about that. I mean, had an incredible experience of multiracial and multi-generational men and women, but definitely there was an enemy. There was incredible civil disobedience, and the civil disobedience was amazing, and I think we did put a fulcrum in patriarchy, and people got to look at patriarchy and write about it and talk about it, but we definitely saw an enemy there.
What if we just replaced enemy with opponent? That's an enemy is somebody who's not a human being. They're an object. They don't have any capacity to grow. They don't have any capacity to connect with us. And ultimately, we can harm them. So I use that idea of enemy, which is other, and I say, absolutely, there was an opponent there. And a lot of the things that have blossomed and turned up over the course of the Kavanaugh nomination have been really powerful, and they've been oppositional in very good ways. Now, not all of them have been like wise beyond whatever, because we're not going to know until what happens next year. Some of the things that people do now are going to make big change, and we don't know what they are. Right now, there might be happening an amazing change of consciousness on the part of men who were blind to what women live with. They were blind.
They still
And,
are.
well, many of them are, and many of them are starting to see. And for me,